Hey everyone, tonight we're going back. We have got a morning inside a 1950s suburban household where the coffee's already percolating and the unwritten rules of the neighbourhood are already watching you from the kitchen window. We've got the story of Levittown, the place that practically invented the post-war suburb, and the social contract that came with it, whether you signed up for that contract or not. We have got a day in the life of the welcome wagon lady, the woman whose job was to show up at your front door with a basket of coupons and a very thorough evaluation of how you were going to fit in. And we have got the truth behind the cheerful surface of 50s suburban life, the things the magazine photographs cropped out, the pressures that never made it into the advertisements, and the quiet, complicated reality of what it actually cost to live inside that gleaming post-war dream. So before you get settled, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending time here. And leave me a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is wherever you are. I love seeing that. Now get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket up and let's go back together. You wake up before the alarm, not because you are disciplined, and not because you are excited about what the day holds, but because somewhere in the back of your sleeping mind a calculation has already been running. The garbage men come on Tuesdays. You need to have the cans at the curb before 7, not at 7, before 7, because Eleanor Marsh on the corner puts hers out at 6:45, and the last time yours were not already there when hers went out, she mentioned it, very pleasantly, at the PTA meeting in front of 9 other women, and the way she mentioned it was the way you mention something that everyone already agrees is a problem. You sit up in the pale light of a Tuesday morning in 1954, and the house is quiet in the specific way that houses are quiet before anyone else in them has decided to wake up. The bedroom is cool, the curtains are the ones you chose from the Sears catalogue, the white ones with the small blueprint because the woman 2 doors down has white eyelet, and you did not want to look like you were copying, but you also did not want to look like you were making a statement. There is a correct amount of effort visible in a suburban window, and you have learned this not from anyone saying it directly, but from the slow accumulation of glances and silences and pleasant remarks that contain entire paragraphs inside them. You get up carefully because your husband is still sleeping, and waking him is not on the schedule until 6:40. The floorboards in this house are new, which means they creak in ways that old floors do not. A particular high note near the closet, a softer complaint near the door, and you have memorized them both because there are things you need to do in the morning before the household is fully in motion, and doing them quietly is part of what makes the morning work. The kitchen is cold when you get there. The house is a Cape Cod with an attached garage, built in 1951 on a street that did not exist in 1948, and the heating system has opinions about which rooms it considers worth warming before 7 in the morning. The kitchen is not one of them. You're wearing your robe, the one your mother-in-law gave you at Christmas, in a shade of green that you would not have chosen but that you wear every morning, because she visits on the second Sunday of the month and she looks at things. The percolator goes on first. This is not a choice. This is the law of the morning, unwritten and absolute. The smell of coffee in a cold kitchen is the smell of the day, deciding to begin in a way that might be manageable, and you need that smell before you need anything else. You fill the pot from the tap, measure the grounds and set it on the burner, and the small blue flame catches and holds, and for a moment you stand there with your hands around the cold aluminum of the pot, and you let yourself just exist in the quiet before any of it starts. The garbage cans, you cannot forget the garbage cans. You go to the back door, the one that opens onto the small concrete porch and the patch of grass that your husband mows on Saturday mornings, in a pattern he has worked out to look orderly from the street, and you drag the metal cans around to the front. The lid clangs against the can and you wince because it is only 6:20 and the Petersons next door have a baby, and waking a baby in this neighbourhood is not the kind of thing that goes unmarked. You set the lid down quietly the second time. You stand at the curb for a moment in your robe and your slippers on the damp grass of a Tuesday morning, looking at the street, which is empty and still, just the identical lines of houses with their identical setbacks and their individual small attempts at personality. The Garfields have a bird bath. The Colemans have a rosebush climbing the mailbox post. You have the blue curtains, and in this light, in this quiet, it is almost beautiful. Almost. Eleanor Marsh's garbage cans are not out yet. You stand there for 1 extra second to register this, then go back inside. The coffee is beginning its work. The smell is filling the kitchen now, and the kitchen is a little warmer, and you tie your robe more firmly and begin the calculation of breakfast. Your husband takes eggs on weekday mornings, fried, not scrambled, with toast cut diagonally rather than straight across because his mother cut it straight across, and he has never said anything directly about this. But once, early in the marriage, you cut it straight across and he looked at it for a moment before he ate it, just a moment, and you have cut it diagonally ever since. The children are another variable. Your daughter, who is 7, will eat what is in front of her if the television is not on, which it is not, because the television in this house does not go on before school. Your son, who is 9, requires negotiation. He has recently decided he does not like eggs, which presents a problem because you have a dozen eggs that need to be used, and eggs are on the breakfast menu because eggs are what you make for breakfast. You have seen enough of the other mothers on the street to understand that there are 2 schools of thought on this. One school says that children eat what is prepared and learn to be grateful. The other school says that children's preferences are a form of self-expression that should be honoured within reason. The problem with the second school is that it has no firm outer boundary, which means that once you start honouring preferences within reason, you have to decide what reason means, and that decision is different every morning. You decide he will eat eggs. By 6:40 the coffee is ready and you pour the first cup and hold it with both hands and drink it standing at the counter, which is Formica in a pattern called boomerang, that the kitchen designer at Sears called modern, and your mother called busy, and your mother was right. But you're not going to say so because you chose it and it is yours, and the kitchen is organised around it now, the canisters in white with red lids, the dish towels in a cheerful red check, the whole thing assembled into a coherent visual story about the kind of household this is, which is the kind that has things under control. That is the other thing about the kitchen. The kitchen is not just where you cook. The kitchen is a communication. Anyone who comes to the back door, which is how neighbours come, not to the front, that is for company and strangers, anyone who comes to the back door sees the kitchen first, and the kitchen tells them something about you, and what it tells them is registered and stored and occasionally mentioned at the PTA meeting. Your husband comes downstairs at 6:40, as scheduled, and you pour his coffee and he sits at the table with the paper and says good morning, and you say good morning, and this exchanges the whole of conversation for the next 20 minutes, because morning has its own grammar and its conversation is mostly procedural. He asks about the day. You say you need to go to the A&P, and that the Hendersons are having their driveway repaved and the crew is coming Thursday. He says, You say Dorothy Henderson mentioned the noise might carry. He says again, and turns a page, and you know that means he has filed the information, and that the driveway repaving and its potential noise implications have been absorbed into his general understanding of the neighbourhood's current state. The neighbourhood's current state is a thing that requires constant maintenance. This is the part no one tells you before you get here. Not the real estate agent, not the women in the magazines with their gleaming appliances and their uncomplicated smiles. They tell you about the good schools and the new construction and the young families, which is all true. What they do not tell you is that a neighbourhood is a living system with its own rules and its own enforcement mechanisms and its own memory, and that memory is long. You moved in 3 years ago. You have learned most of the rules. Some you learned by being told directly by someone who took it upon themselves to inform you, which in this neighbourhood is usually Gertrude Kowalski, who lives at the far end of the street and whose directness is considered a community service by some and a social hazard by others. From Gertrude you learned that grass should be cut before it reaches a height that makes the neighbours uncomfortable, which Gertrude specified as 3 inches, though she did not explain how she arrived at that figure. From Gertrude you learned that washing hung on a line should be taken in before dark, not for any practical reason, but because a line of laundry after dark looks unfinished, and looking unfinished is, in this neighbourhood, a statement. But most of the rules you learned the slower way, through observation and inference and the occasional pleasant remark that contained an entire instruction manual inside it. The rule about garbage cans, for instance. No one told you there was a hierarchy of garbage can placement. You understood it by watching, noticing who put theirs out first, and who seemed satisfied by this, and then by the Eleanor Marsh incident, which clarified the stakes. The rule is not written anywhere. It exists in the collective understanding of the street, maintained by attention and social memory. Then there is the rule about lawn ornaments. This one is subtler. Lawn ornaments are technically permitted. No one has said anything against them, but there is a register in which they are acceptable, arranged between too plain and too expressive, and anything outside that range attracts attention. The Giordanos, who are Italian and have been in the neighbourhood since before most of the current families arrived, have a small concrete Madonna near their front steps. This is understood to be their tradition, and is treated accordingly with a kind of affectionate exemption. But when the Turners, who moved in last spring, put up a collection of painted wooden cutouts of ducks in their front garden, 3 ducks in ascending size, something changed in the atmosphere of the street. No one said anything to the Turners directly, but the ducks were mentioned, and the way they were mentioned told you everything you needed to know about where they fell on the register. By 7:15 the children are at the table. Your daughter is eating her eggs with the focused application of someone getting through a task. Your son has eaten his toast, but is engaged in a careful geographic separation of his eggs from the rest of his plate, a separation he is performing with the systematic attention of a small engineer. You watch this and say nothing because the eggs are on the plate and the eggs are being engaged with, which is the relevant standard this morning. Your husband finishes his coffee and takes his briefcase and kisses you on the cheek and says the usual things about dinner and the usual question about the car, whether you need the car today, and you say you will walk to the A&P, and he nods and goes out the back door and gets into the Chevrolet and backs down the driveway, with the particular careful deliberateness of a man who knows the neighbours are already watching, or might be, and drives away, and the house is suddenly and completely yours. This is the best moment of the morning. Not because the morning has been bad, it has been ordinary, which is what a morning is supposed to be, but because ordinary mornings have weight and administration and a constant low-level management of expectations, and the moment the car pulls out of the driveway, that weight redistributes itself in a way that is not exactly lighter, but is at least different. You are still managing the household. You are still responsible for the unwritten rules of the street and the presentation of the kitchen and the diagonal cut of the toast. But you are managing it on your own time for the next hour, before the children need to be at school, and that distinction matters more than it probably should. You clear the breakfast dishes and run the hot water and wash them the way you always wash them, in order of size, largest to smallest, which is not a rule anyone told you about, it is just how your hands have decided to do it, and while you wash, you look out the window above the sink at the backyard, at the patch of grass your husband mows on Saturday, and the clothesline that you take things off before dark, and the small vegetable garden at the back fence that you started 2 summers ago, and that produced tomatoes so good last August that you are still talking about them in October. The garden is yours, specifically. Not in a legal way. The property belongs equally to both of you, but in the way that certain parts of a household develop a primary relationship with one person. Your husband mows, you garden. These territories were not negotiated or discussed. They emerged over time like a dialect, the specific language of how 2 people share a space. Outside the window the morning is brightening and the dew is still on the grass, and somewhere down the street you can hear the Kowalski children starting their argument about something, which they do every morning with the same impressive commitment, and the garbage truck is making its way up the block with its familiar grinding progress, and you feel, standing at the sink with the warm water running over your hands and the coffee still working in your chest, something that is not quite contentment but is its nearest neighbour, the sense of being inside a life that is recognisable to itself, that has a shape you understand, that makes sense in the small mechanical ways that a life needs to make sense before it can make sense in any larger way. And then you remember that you need to call Dorothy Henderson about Thursday and decide whether to mention the ducks to anyone or let it go, and whether your son's egg geography constitutes a behavioural pattern worth noting, or a phase that will resolve itself, and whether Eleanor Marsh's garbage cans being out after yours this morning was noticed by anyone besides you, and the pleasant almost contentment adjusts itself back into the familiar low hum of management, and you dry your hands and you begin the day properly. The walk to the A&P takes 12 minutes if you go the direct way, and 18 if you go by Clover Street, and you go by Clover Street because the direct way passes the Hanson house, and you're not yet ready to run into Barbara Hanson, who mentioned last week that the azaleas along your front walk were looking a little sparse, which they are, but the timing and the way of the mentioning meant something, and you have not finished deciding what. By Clover Street you pass the new house that went up last fall, still not quite settled into the street. The planting's not mature enough yet to soften the newness, and you can see one of the windows has a kind of curtain arrangement that is more bohemian than the street usually supports. You notice this. You do not draw any conclusions. You file it. The A&P is cool inside and smells of cardboard and floor wax and the faint sweetness of the bakery counter at the back, You have a list, written in the small notebook you keep in your pocketbook, the one with the green cover that your daughter decorated with a sticker of a daisy. The list is organised by aisle because you have been shopping in this A&P for 3 years and you know its geography the way you know any familiar space, without thinking, by the body. Campbell's soup, 3 cans, Crisco, the large tin, bread, white, the Wonder, which your mother disapproves of and which the children love, coffee, the Folgers, sugar, butter, and something for Friday, because Friday you are having the Andersons for dinner, the first time since they moved in, and this dinner is a thing that carries its own weight, its own grammar, its own system of unspoken rules about what a first dinner with new neighbours is supposed to communicate about the kind of household you run. You stand in the soup aisle and think about Friday. The Andersons are from Ohio and have 2 children about the same ages as yours, and Harold Anderson works in insurance, and Cynthia Anderson has a smile that is either warm or performative, and you have not yet had enough time with her to know which. For the dinner you are considering a roast, because a roast says something particular. It says comfort and effort, and enough confidence in your cooking not to feel you need to produce anything impressive. A roast says, I am giving you a real dinner. A casserole would say something different. A casserole says easy, which sounds modest but can read as indifferent if you're not careful. You know the women who bring casseroles when someone is sick or has a baby, and you know the women who bring a proper hot dish, and the distinction is noted. Roast then, with potatoes, and something for dessert that is homemade but not showy, because showy at a first dinner is a declaration of intent, and you're not sure yet what your intent is with the Andersons beyond basic neighbourliness, which has its own requirements but is different from friendship, which is a longer commitment. You put the Crisco in your basket and move toward the meat counter, nodding to a woman from the next street whose name you know but cannot quite retrieve in time to use, and the morning continues, organised and unwritten and full of its own specific weight, the weight of a life lived in close proximity to other lives, all of them watching, all of them being watched, all of them working hard to make it look like they're not working at all. Later, when the groceries are put away and the children are at school and the house is quiet, you sit down at the kitchen table with the second cup of coffee you've been thinking about since breakfast, and you look at the pattern on the formica, the boomerang shapes in grey and white and the faint suggestion of mint, and you think about the weekend in 1948 when you and your husband drove out here the first time to see what they were building, all these houses on this flat land that used to be potato farms, and the salesman had shown you a floor plan and a model home with a kitchen done in yellow and chrome, and it had seemed like the future. It had seemed like a place where things would be organised and manageable and clean, and where the future would turn out to be something you could trust. And that is mostly true. The future turned out to be organised and manageable and mostly clean. It turned out to have rules, which you learned, and a hierarchy, which you navigated, and a constant low-level social attention that never entirely turns off. It turned out to be a full-time job that no one wrote down in any job description. You finish the coffee and wash the cup and put it away. The kitchen is quiet and the morning light is good. Outside, somewhere down the street, someone is mowing a lawn, which is technically not against any rule but is considered ambitious for a Tuesday. You make a note of it. Not in the notebook. In the other place, the one that keeps track of things you do not write down. The one that runs all day and never entirely sleeps. The one that is already planning what to make for Friday, and whether to say anything about the bohemian curtains, and what exactly Barbara Hanson meant about the azaleas, and whether, this time, you might plant something bold enough to not require any explanation at all. The afternoon is its own country. Morning has a grammar you have learned. Morning runs on coffee and schedules and the mechanical satisfaction of tasks that repeat, with enough predictability to be navigated in your sleep, or near enough. Afternoon is different. Afternoon is where the day gets personal. By noon, the dishes from breakfast are done and the beds are made, and making beds is a thing you do without thinking about it. The hospital corners your mother taught you, the pillowcases smoothed and turned under, the bedspread pulled tight enough that a quarter would bounce, which is a standard you were given by your mother-in-law early in the marriage as an observation rather than a criticism, though the distinction was not entirely clear. You make the beds because made beds are the minimum viable standard for a household that is presenting itself correctly, and because somewhere in the repetition of daily maintenance there is a kind of order that costs almost nothing to maintain, and costs quite a lot to lose. The laundry is Tuesday's other major obligation, Monday is sheets. Tuesday is everything else. The clothes that have accumulated through the week in the hampers, his work shirts, the children's things, your own dresses and house dresses, and the blouses that require pressing. The washer is a Maytag Ringer model that came with the house and that you have a complicated relationship with, respectful, cautious, occasionally resentful. The Ringer will eat a shirt button if you give it the opportunity, and you have learned not to give it the opportunity. You have also learned which fabrics require which water temperature, which items can be washed together and which cannot, which things need to be turned inside out before they go through the Ringer, and which need to stay right side out or the Ringer creases will set in the wrong direction. You carry the wet laundry to the backyard in a wicker basket that is heavier than it ought to be, because wet laundry is always heavier than you have prepared yourself for, and you hang it on the line with the wooden clothespins from the bag that hangs on the line post. You have a system for this too, shirts on the outside line because they are tall and block the view of the smaller things, children's items in the middle where they are less visible from the street, your underclothes on the inside line nearest the house, because there are limits to what needs to be visible to the neighbourhood, and this is one of them. The act of hanging laundry is one of those tasks that is almost meditative if you let it be. Your hands know what to do, the pins click into place, the clothes lift in the October breeze and begin their drying in the pale sunlight. You stand for a moment with the empty basket against your hip, and you look at the yard, at the garden at the back fence where the tomato plants are finished and starting to go brown, and at the oak tree in the corner that has been dropping leaves since early September and will not stop until November, and at the maple that your husband planted 2 years ago that is just now beginning to show some colour at the edges of its leaves. You have opinions about the yard that you do not always share. You would like, for instance, a rose garden along the back fence, something that would require attention and that would produce something beautiful rather than merely orderly. Your husband is not opposed to a rose garden in principle, but rose gardens require decisions and decisions require weekends, and weekend time in this household is managed by competing claims, the lawn, the car, the various small repairs that a house generates with the steady productivity of a small factory. The rose garden waits. You have decided that it waits on the list of things that will happen when the time is right, which is the list that keeps you company during the Tuesday laundry. After lunch, which you eat standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down for lunch alone feels like a larger commitment than the midday hours usually support, you address the afternoon's administrative work. Administrative work is perhaps too formal a term for what is essentially the correspondence and planning and social management of the household, but there is no better word for the accumulation of tasks that require thought and paper and the telephone, things that do not fit into any physical category, but that take time and attention and represent the invisible infrastructure of a functioning household. The letter to your sister in Milwaukee, which you have been meaning to write for 2 weeks. The thank you note to your husband's mother for the birthday gift that arrived last month. The RSVPs for 2 different events in October, the Hendersons' dinner party and the church bazaar committee, and the question of whether you can reasonably accept both invitations, which requires a calculation involving the social cost of declining the Hendersons against the social cost of overcommitting to the bazaar committee, a committee you joined last spring in a moment of civic enthusiasm that has been testing your commitment ever since. You sit at the small desk in the corner of the living room, which is not a proper study or a home office, that would have required a room to be devoted to the purpose, but is a corner that has been organised around the functions of correspondence and record keeping, a wooden desk with a green blotter and a lamp, and a row of small pigeonholes in the back where you keep the stationery, and the address book, and the small folder of receipts, and the children's school schedules, and the neighbourhood directory from the Homeowners Association, and the various other pieces of paper that constitute the documentary evidence of a household in operation. The telephone is in the kitchen, which means you go back and forth between the desk and the kitchen for the calls that afternoon requires. Dorothy Henderson about Thursday, and Dorothy is on the phone for 45 minutes because Dorothy is constitutionally unable to have a brief telephone conversation. She circles her subject with the patient thoroughness of an aircraft waiting for clearance, and by the end of the call you know considerably more about the driveway repaving project and its implications than you needed to know. But you also know that Dorothy's second daughter is having trouble at school, and that Dorothy is worried about it in a way she cannot quite say directly, and you make a note, not in the notebook, in the other place, to be available on this subject. The children come home at 3:15. This is the transition that reorganises the afternoon. Before 3:15, the house has the particular quality of an occupied but quiet space, a place that is running but not loud, your footsteps and the washer and the radio on low and the small ambient sounds of a house going about its business. After 3:15, the house is different. It has a new centre of gravity, 2 new moving bodies with their own needs and their own momentum and their own weather. Your daughter comes in first, because she runs from the bus stop and your son walks, and she drops her school bag in the exact centre of the kitchen floor where it will be stepped on, which is a location you have asked her not to choose approximately 400 times, and she is already talking before the door is fully open, telling you about something that happened at recess involving a girl named Marjorie and a jump rope, and an injustice that requires your full attention and your immediate agreement that Marjorie was wrong. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. You give her milk and a cookie and your full attention and your immediate agreement that the situation was unjust, which you can provide because it clearly was. Marjorie was wrong. This is evident from the description, and you say so, and she absorbs your agreement with the satisfaction of someone whose case has been proven in the highest court available to her, which is you, and goes to do her homework. Your son comes in 4 minutes after his sister, unhurried, and he drops his bag not in the centre of the floor but in the doorway, which is technically not the centre of the floor, and which he considers an improvement, and he wants to know if he can go to Tommy Chen's house. And the question of Tommy Chen's house is the question you have been half expecting, since Tommy Chen moved in on the next street in September. Tommy Chen's family is Chinese, which is new on this part of New Jersey, and the neighbourhood's response to their arrival has been complicated in the way that you have come to recognise as the neighbourhood's characteristic response to anything that requires it to adjust its understanding of itself. Some families have been welcoming, some have been neutral in a way that contains an opinion, and 2 families, you know which 2, have been something else. Something that you have no official position on but that you have registered in the other place, the one that keeps track. Your son likes Tommy Chen because Tommy Chen has a very elaborate set of Lincoln logs and a father who lets them build in the living room, which your husband does not allow because of the carpet. You let your son go to Tommy Chen's house. You do this without deliberation because there is nothing to deliberate about. But you make a note in the notebook this time to invite Tommy Chen over for Saturday, because Saturday the construction in the living room can happen in the backyard, and because the invitation will communicate something to the families on this street that you would like to communicate. Your daughter finishes her homework at 4:30 and you check it, and she has reversed 2 letters in a word on the spelling exercise, a habit she has had since 1st grade that her teacher says she will grow out of, and that you have been watching for the signs of growing out of for 2 years. You correct it gently. You tell her the word again. She writes it correctly. This small exchange, repeated in various forms across various subjects several times a week, is the work of being present for a child's education, the maintenance of attention that keeps a small person's learning on track, and it is work that is invisible in the sense that no one other than your daughter will ever know you did it, but that is as concrete in its effects as any visible labour. By 5:30 you're thinking about dinner. Dinner is the day's major production, the meal that carries the most social weight, when the family assembles and the household presents itself to itself, and the quality of the dinner is legible in a way that no other meal is. A poor dinner at 5:30 on a Tuesday evening is a statement about the afternoon that produced it. A good dinner at 5:30 on a Tuesday evening is evidence that the household is functioning as it should. Tonight you are making pot roast, which you started at 3 o'clock because pot roast requires time and patience, and a Dutch oven that has been seasoning itself since before you were married. Pot roast is not a showy dinner. Pot roast is a reliable dinner, warm and filling, and the kind of thing that produces its own smell through the afternoon, a smell that fills the house by 4, and that means something specific to everyone in it. Means that the evening will be warm and the table will be full, and that someone has been tending to the household while the rest of it went out into the world. Your husband arrives at 6:10. The train is occasionally late, and when it is late you adjust dinner by holding the roast in the oven on low and keeping the vegetables separate so they do not overcook, which is a small logistical problem you have solved many times. Tonight the train is on time and he comes through the back door and puts his briefcase in the hall and says the smell is good, and you say thank you. And this exchange is shorter than the morning exchange but contains the same essential grammar, the acknowledgement that the household is in order and that the day has concluded within its normal parameters. Dinner is 40 minutes. There is conversation about school and about the train, and about a colleague of your husband's who is doing something that requires comment, and there is your son's account of the Lincoln logs at Tommy Chen's house, which he delivers with the engineering enthusiasm of a child who has spent 2 hours with a very satisfying construction project, and your daughter's version of the Marjorie injustice, which has been refined through the afternoon into a tighter narrative. Your husband listens to both with the attentiveness of a man who is tired but who understands that the dinner table is a place where attention is required, and he says the appropriate things at the appropriate moments, and the meal moves through its arc from soup to pot roast to the apple. Better you made from the apples that came off the tree at the back of the garden, the one that your daughter climbed last month and was told not to climb again. Dishes afterward, homework checked again, baths. The children's bedtime is 8:30, which requires negotiation, not with the children directly, but with the day's accumulated momentum, the slight resistance that 8:30 produces every evening as the transition point between the children's time and whatever follows it. You read to your daughter, the chapter book she's been working through since September, a story about a family of rabbits that has been going on long enough that you feel personally invested in the rabbits, and you sit on the edge of her bed in the lamplight and read 2 chapters while she lies with her eyes half closed in the complicated descent towards sleep that children perform every night, the gradual surrender of the day. Your son is supposed to be reading on his own, and he is doing something in his room that you are choosing to believe is reading. You check at 8:45 and he is in fact reading, a book about how bridges are built, which you file with the Lincoln logs and the egg geography as data points in the ongoing project of understanding who he is and who he is going to be. By 9, the house is quiet. Your husband is in the living room with the newspaper and the radio, the evening news, and then, if the day was the right kind of day, something musical. You wash the dinner dishes and put them away and wipe down the counter and the stove and the table and the formica in its boomerang pattern, the nightly restoration of the kitchen to its correct state, and then you stand for a moment in the clean kitchen with the lights all on and the house quiet, and you feel, again, the thing that is close to contentment but is not quite contentment, the thing that is the satisfaction of a system that has run correctly for another day, that has produced what it was supposed to produce, that has maintained what it was supposed to maintain. You have not resolved the question about the Andersons' Friday dinner. You have not decided about the azaleas. You have not determined whether the bohemian curtain arrangement on the new house warrants a mention or a wait-and-see approach. These things will be there tomorrow, on the list, in the other place, ready to be managed as the day requires. You turn off the kitchen light and go to sit with your husband, and the radio is playing something that is not quite jazz and not quite not jazz. The sound of 1954 doing its best with the instruments it had, and you sit in the lamp glow of the living room while the street outside goes quiet in its careful suburban way. One by one, the lights going off down the block, one by one, the households coming to the end of their day, all of them running the same calculations, maintaining the same presentations, carrying the same weight in their own particular way, all of it invisible from outside, all of it utterly present from within. There is something worth saying about the specific texture of the waiting that domestic life in the 1950s required. The long middle hours of Tuesday when the children were at school, and the husband was at work, and the house was clean enough that cleaning it again would be premature, but not so clean that there was no maintenance to perform. This was the time that the magazine spreads never photographed. The advertisements placed their subjects in the kitchen in the morning, at the stove, productive and purposeful. They placed them in the living room in the evening, welcoming and composed. The middle hours, the slow Tuesday afternoon when the laundry was drying on the line and the pot roast was in the oven, and there was genuinely nothing that needed doing for the next 90 minutes. That middle time was not considered photogenic. But the middle time was real, and it had its own quality. Neither the productive urgency of morning nor the social composure of evening, just the quiet of a house being occupied by a single adult who is neither performing nor managing but simply present, with her own thoughts and her own restlessness, and whatever she does with 90 minutes that belong entirely to her. What women did with that time varied enormously, and was, as a subject of community attention, surprisingly loaded. Reading was generally acceptable, improving the mind, part of the domestic project of being a well-informed wife and mother, and conversational partner for the husband. Watching television during the day was more complicated. The daytime television schedules in the early 1950s were not yet the elaborate soap opera and variety programming they would become by the end of the decade, but what existed was sufficient to attract viewers, and a woman who watched television in the afternoon was operating at the boundary of what the neighbourhood's unspoken standards about appropriate use of time considered acceptable. Not a transgression exactly, but something that required managing, that was not freely discussed, that was done with the curtains drawn in a way that keeping the curtains open for all other activities was not. Writing letters was unambiguously respectable, an act of social maintenance and intellectual engagement, and many women of this era were prolific correspondents, maintaining exchanges with family members and former neighbours and college friends and distant relatives that constituted over decades a documentary record of domestic life that historians have found invaluable. The letters are often funny and frank in ways that the women's public presentations were not, because a letter to a sister in Milwaukee was private in a way that the morning at the kitchen window was not, and privacy created a different register of honesty. Gardening was respectable but hierarchically organised. A kitchen garden, producing vegetables and herbs, was practical and therefore approved of, the direct expression of a domestic value through physical labour. A flower garden was aesthetically oriented and permitted at the level of the backyard, where it was a personal pleasure not visible to the street. A front yard flower garden was a public statement, subject to neighbourhood standards about what a front yard should look like and what it communicated about the household's priorities. Elaborate front yard gardening that suggested the housewife had strong aesthetic opinions about public space was navigated carefully, approved of when it increased the visual quality of the street but potentially problematic if it deviated too far from neighbourhood norms in the direction of either exuberance or eccentricity. The sewing circle and the church circle and the book club were the legitimate and approved middle-time activities for women who wanted company and intellectual engagement during the day, the official institutions through which social connection was maintained and cultural life of a limited but real kind was conducted. These institutions required the same performance of effortless competence that the household required. You brought the right food and wore the right thing, and contributed to the conversation at the right level, engaged enough to be interesting, restrained enough not to dominate. The book club discussion was as carefully managed as the dinner party, operating within its own set of unwritten rules about which kinds of reactions to a book were appropriate and which were considered excessive. And then there were the things that happened in the middle time that were not officially part of anything, that were the private lives of private people conducted in the unobserved hours of a Tuesday, the afternoon nap taken not because you were ill, but because you were simply tired in a way that could be admitted in private even if not in public, the cup of tea consumed with a novel that was not improving literature but was simply enjoyable, the half hour spent in the backyard garden not because anything needed doing, but because you wanted to be outside in the October sun with your hands in the soil and your mind not managing anything at all. These small private pleasures were the counter-economy of domestic life, the unofficial compensation for the official labour, the human residue left over after all the performance and management and maintenance had been accounted for. They were rarely discussed and rarely photographed and almost never acknowledged in the public discourse about what suburban domestic life was like. But they were there, reliable as Tuesday, in the 90 minutes between the pot roast going in and the children coming home, in the small unstructured freedoms that no system of social rules can entirely eliminate because people find them anyway, in the gaps and the middle hours and the not yet ready moments of an ordinary day. The street outside the kitchen window on a Tuesday morning in 1954 is, from any aerial photograph, indistinguishable from 10,000 other suburban streets across the post-war American landscape. The same setbacks, the same roof pitches, the same rectangles of lawn, the same general grammar of post-war residential design that produced, in the years between 1945 and 1960, more single-family homes than had been built in the entire previous history of the country. That scale is worth pausing on because it shaped the rules. When Levittown built 17,000 houses on Long Island, it did not create 17,000 isolated households. It created a community, whether it intended to or not, and a community is always a system with its own regulatory mechanisms, its own methods of enforcing the standards that make communal proximity manageable. The rules you navigate on your Tuesday morning, the garbage can hierarchy and the curtain register, and the casserole ethics, are not the invention of your particular neighbourhood. They are the organic expression of a social contract that Levittown and its many successors called into being when they placed families on identical lots on curved streets within sight of each other's front windows. This is the connection between the individual Tuesday morning and the larger story of how the suburb was built. The kitchen window is not just a kitchen window. It is a social position, a place from which the neighbourhood is observed and from which the neighbourhood observes in return, and that reciprocal observation is not accidental. It was designed into the street layout, built into the setbacks and the lot sizes and the placement of the houses in their sites. Levitt knew what he was building when he curved the streets. He was building a system of mutual visibility, which is also a system of mutual accountability, which is also, finally, the infrastructure of the social rules that you're navigating on your way to the A&P. The personal and the structural are always connected in suburban life, connected more tightly and more visibly than in urban life, where anonymity provides some insulation from the accountability of proximity, or in rural life, where distance provides a different kind of insulation. The suburb is the condition in which the two dimensions meet most directly, where the individual household is closest to its neighbours and furthest from the anonymity that releases individuals from the weight of collective expectations. This is the specific experience the welcome wagon was designed to address, and that the social rules were designed to maintain, and it is the experience that the magazine photographs were designed to make look easy. It was not easy. It was, as we've seen, a full-time project requiring the constant management of presentation and relationship and reputation across a social field that never fully turned off and never fully forgave. The women who did this work did it largely without acknowledgement, which is the characteristic condition of work that has been designated domestic and therefore invisible, and they did it with a competence that is more visible in retrospect than it was at the time, now that we can see what was required and can measure what was delivered against the resources that were available to deliver it. What they built, in the aggregate, was community. Imperfect community, exclusionary in its design and costly in its maintenance, but real community nonetheless. The kind in which your neighbours know your name and your children play in each other's yards, and the block party in August produces the specific pleasure of belonging to a place that knows you. That is worth something. It is worth naming, alongside everything else that needs to be named. There is a particular kind of man who looks at a potato farm and sees a city. William Levitt was that man, though he would have called it something more modest, a community, a neighbourhood, a good place to raise a family, and he would have meant all of those things with perfect sincerity, while also meaning something else underneath them. He meant a market, he meant an assembly line, he meant the most ambitious application of industrial efficiency to the ancient problem of housing that the American century had yet attempted. And the result was Levittown, a name that became, over the decades that followed, both an insult and an aspiration, a symbol of everything that was wrong with post-war conformity and everything that was right about giving ordinary Americans a piece of solid ground to stand on. To understand what Levittown meant, you have to understand what it was built on top of. Not just the potato farms of Long Island, though those are where the first version went up, but the specific hunger that the end of the Second World War created in the American population. 16 million veterans came home, and they came home to a country that was theoretically ready for them but practically unprepared. There was a housing crisis of a scale that is difficult to convey now. Young couples were living with parents, with in-laws, in converted garages and basement apartments, and army surplus Quonset huts on college campuses. The GI Bill had given veterans the ability to buy homes with government-backed mortgages, but there were not enough homes to buy. The supply side of the equation was broken, still operating on the slow, craft-based model of construction that had always built houses one at a time, each one a custom project, each one requiring months of skilled labour. William Levitt had spent the war years building Navy housing projects, and what he took away from that experience was the knowledge that a house was, at its essential level, a manufacturing problem. You broke it into components. You standardized the components. You organized the labor into specialized teams that each did one thing and moved on. You did not let a carpenter finish a wall and then come back and do the flooring. You had a flooring team that did nothing but flooring, moving from house to house in sequence like a wave. You had a painting team, a plumbing team, a roofing team. And the houses moved through the production sequence the way cars moved through the Ford River Rouge plant. Except the cars did not move and the workers did, which was the innovation, the specific genius of the thing that made it all work. In 1947, Levitt and Sons began construction on what would become Levittown, New York, on 1,500 acres of Long Island farmland that they had been quietly accumulating since the war ended. the first houses went up at a rate that seemed impossible to anyone who had watched conventional construction. In the peak years, Levitt's crews were completing more than 30 houses a day. 30 houses in a day. At a price point just under $8,000 for a basic Cape Cod model that was within reach of a veteran with a GI loan and a steady paycheck. The houses were small by later standards. The original Cape Cods were 720 square feet on a slab foundation, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a kitchen and a living room. But they came with a built-in Admiral television set, a Bendix washing machine, and a refrigerator, all of which were included in the purchase price, and which represented in 1947 a level of automatic domestic equipment that most American families had never experienced. The houses also came with a lot. An actual piece of land, a front yard and a backyard, something that apartment dwellers and crowded urban renters had not had access to. The yard was small, but it was yours. That distinction meant everything. The demand was immediate and overwhelming. On the first day Levitt opened sales in 1947, more than 1,000 families signed up. Within days the number was in the thousands. People camped on the sidewalk outside the sales office. The waiting list grew longer than the project's initial capacity, which caused Levitt to expand, and then to expand again, until Levittown, New York eventually contained more than 17,000 homes and more than 80,000 people, making it, at the time of its completion, the largest private housing development in American history. The physical design of Levittown was not accidental. Every detail was considered, calculated, and tested against what Levitt understood about the social behaviour of his target demographic, which was young veterans with young families who wanted safety, community, and the specific post-war American dream of private household that was also part of a larger, organised, recognisably decent neighbourhood. The streets curved. This was not just aesthetic. Straight streets, Levitt understood, invited through traffic and created the anonymity of a grid. Curved streets slowed traffic and created natural gathering points, cul-de-sacs and round points where neighbours met, where children played, where community accumulated. The houses faced each other at angles that maximised the social possibility of front yards. The lots were identical in size, but the houses were rotated on them, so that no 2 identical models sat directly side by side, which gave the street the visual impression of variety. Levitt was not trying to make all the houses look the same. He was trying to make them look like a neighbourhood, which is a subtler and more demanding project. A neighbourhood has coherence without uniformity. It has a visual grammar that every house speaks and that no individual house dominates. The rules that came with the Levittown home were part of this project of managed coherence, and they were written into the original leases because Levitt initially rented many of his houses before converting them to sales, and the lease was where the community standards were made explicit. You could not build a fence without permission. You could not add a room or a garage without following a design review process. You could not dry laundry outside on Sundays. You were required to mow your lawn at least once a week between April and November. The lawn mowing rule is worth pausing on because it is the most revealing of the bunch. It was not enforced by the town government. Because there was no town government, Levittown was not and is not an incorporated municipality. It was enforced by Levitt himself, through the lease, through the homeowners association, and through the most powerful enforcement mechanism in any close-knit community, social pressure. A man whose lawn was too long was a man who did not understand the community he was part of. He was, implicitly, a man who could not be trusted to hold up his end of the implicit agreement that everyone had made by choosing to live here. The lawn was not just grass. The lawn was evidence of character. This is where the Levittown story gets complicated, and it is worth sitting with the complication rather than looking away from it. The community that Levitt built, and the social norms that made it cohere, were inseparable from a profound and explicit racial exclusion. The original Levittown leases contained a clause prohibiting resale or rental to people who were not members of the Caucasian race. Levitt's stated position on this was not that he was personally committed to segregation, but that his buyers, whom he was serving, expected and demanded it. He was, he said, a builder, not a politician. This defence, which was common among developers of the era, does not survive examination. Levitt made choices at every level of his development about street layouts, about house designs, about lawn mowing rules and fence regulations and the placement of community swimming pools. The choice to exclude black veterans and their families from the post-war prosperity he was selling was as deliberate as any other design decision. And the consequences were lasting. The wealth that Levittown's homeowners accumulated over the following decades, as property values rose steadily through the 1950s and 60s, was wealth that was systematically denied to black families who had served in the same war and had access to the same GI mortgages but not to the same houses. The second Levittown, built in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, beginning in 1951, was nearly as large as the first and operated under the same restrictions. When a black family, William and Daisy Myers, finally moved into Levittown, Pennsylvania in 1957, having purchased a home from a white family who was moving away, they were met with a sustained campaign of harassment that lasted months and required police protection. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Crowds gathered outside their house, windows were broken, burning crosses were planted in neighbouring yards. The Myers family stayed, and eventually the harassment diminished. But the event was a visible demonstration of what the unwritten social rules of the post-war suburb were actually protecting. Levitt himself eventually moderated his public position on integration, and by the mid-1960s he had removed the exclusionary clauses from his leases, partly under pressure from the federal government, and partly, perhaps, because the moral position had simply become too difficult to defend publicly. But the communities he had built retained their demographic character through mechanisms that no longer required explicit language, through social selection, through real estate steering, through the accumulated wealth advantages of 2 decades of exclusively white home ownership that made it practically difficult for black families to enter the market even after the legal barriers were removed. None of this cancels what Levitt built. The Cape Cods and ranch houses and expanded models that stand on Long Island and in Bucks County, and in the New Jersey Levittown that came later, are real houses where real families lived real lives. The veterans who came home broke and crowded and took their GI loans to Levitt sales offices and walked away with a deed to a piece of American grass were not naive or foolish. They wanted what was available. They wanted what was being offered. The system that offered it to them was not their design. But the system was somebody's design, and the someone who designed it made choices about what to include and what to exclude, about who counted as a neighbour and who did not, about which part of the post-war dream was for everyone and which part had conditions attached. Those choices shaped the physical landscape of American suburban life for generations. They shaped which families built equity and which did not. They shaped which children grew up in the good schools and which did not. William Levitt died in 1994, having built more than 140,000 homes across his career, and having sold his company in 1968 for $50 million in a transaction that left him richer than anyone in his organisation expected, but not as rich as he had planned, because the buyer turned out to be less reliable than advertised, and the payment was largely in stock that declined. His final years were marked by litigation and financial difficulty, a diminishment that felt to those who followed his career like something out of a story with a design to it. He remained convinced until the end that what he had built was good, that the communities he created had given real Americans a real stake in the country, and that this was worth something permanent and important. He was right about that. He was not entirely right about everything else. And the distance between those two things is the space where the real history of the post-war American suburb lives, not in the cheerful magazine photographs, not in the lawn mowing rules, but in the accounting of who got in and who was kept out, and what that difference in the end cost everyone. What Levitt built was not just houses. He built a template, a way of imagining what American domestic life should look like and what it should require of the people living inside it. The curved streets and the identical lots and the covenants about fences and laundry and lawn heights were a theory of community, an idea about how people should relate to each other in proximity, what they owed each other and what they could expect in return. It was, as theories go, not entirely wrong. People did become neighbours. Children did play together on those curving streets. Barbecues and block parties and the particular intimacy of sharing a street through seasons and years and the ordinary crises of ordinary life did produce genuine community in those identical houses. But the theory was built on an exclusion that made its pretensions to community incomplete in a fundamental way. A community that defines itself partly by who it will not include is not a community in the full sense. it is a club. And the difference between a community and a club, when you are standing on the outside of it looking in, is everything. There is a particular irony in the fact that the man who built the most carefully designed communal environment in American residential history was, by temperament and inclination, a loner. William Levitt did not socialise much with his buyers. He did not attend the block parties on the streets he had designed, did not drop by to see how the lawns were holding up, did not sit in the living rooms of the houses he had manufactured and contemplate what had been made. He built the container and left the community to fill it, which was, in its own way, the most honest statement he could have made about what his project actually was. But the container shaped the community in ways that were more profound than any single set of rules or restrictions. The physical form of Levittown, the curve of the streets, the setbacks and lot sizes, and the careful variety within uniformity of the house designs encoded a set of social assumptions about how people should live together that are worth unpacking. Levitt assumed that the primary unit of social life was the nuclear family. He assumed that the nuclear family operated on a specific model. The male breadwinner who left the suburb in the morning and returned in the evening. The female homemaker who was present in the suburb all day. The children who attended the schools that the suburb's density made economically viable. He designed for this model with such precision that the design itself became a kind of enforcement mechanism, making it easier to live this way than any other way, making the deviation from this model require special effort and produce social friction. The cul-de-sac, which Levitt did not invent but which he deployed with particular systematicity, is an instructive case. A dead-end street with a turning circle at the end is, architecturally, a social event. It produces a cluster of houses that face each other with nowhere else to look. The children on a cul-de-sac play together not only by choice but by geography. The mothers of those children encounter each other not only by intention but by default, in the driveway, at the mailbox, in the specific radius of surveillance that a group of houses facing a common turning circle creates. The cul-de-sac is a community manufacturing device, and Levitt understood this and deployed it as such. The density of early Levittown was another designed social fact. 17,000 families on a relatively small patch of Long Island created a social environment that was, by intention, a small city masquerading as a collection of individual households. The school population density justified schools, the consumer density justified shopping centres, the population concentration justified community pools and baseball diamonds, and the civic infrastructure that a dispersed rural population could not economically support. Levitt did not merely build houses. He built the conditions under which community of a specific kind became not only possible, but financially necessary. The swimming pools are worth pausing on because they are a particularly clear example of the way designed space encodes social values. Levittown had community swimming pools, built and maintained by the development, open to residents. This was an amenity that distinguished Levittown from earlier working-class housing developments and that communicated powerfully that Levitt's product was something different from a housing project, something aspirational, something that granted access to a kind of leisure that had previously been associated with a higher economic stratum. But the pools were also, until 1958, formally segregated. Black families, of whom there were virtually none in Levittown proper, due to the exclusionary covenants, could not use the pools even in the temporary periods when black workers or visitors were present in the development. The pools that were designed to bind the community together, to give it a shared leisure space and a shared physical identity, were simultaneously a mechanism for marking the boundaries of the community's definition of itself. The amenity and the exclusion were not separate features, they were the same feature. The commercial strip that Levitt built alongside his residential development was another designed social institution. The shopping centre, a concept that was just beginning to organise itself into its modern form in the years when Levitt was building his communities, was placed at the development's centre of gravity, close enough for residents to access on foot or by a short drive, but designed with the car in mind, with parking that could accommodate the volumes of a captive consumer population. The merchants in the Levittown shopping centre had something that most retail businesses of the era could only dream of, a customer base that was geographically committed and demographically predictable, and that had been selected for a specific income range and lifestyle that made their purchasing behaviour unusually consistent. Levitt understood that the shopping centre was a community anchor, a place where residents became consumers and consumers became neighbours. where the act of buying groceries or hardware or dry goods was also the act of running into your neighbours and generating the small social interactions that community requires. He designed the shopping centre with this in mind, with pedestrian areas and seating, and the small details that encourage lingering, which is not what a shopping centre primarily wants, but which is what a community requires. By the early 1960s, when Levittown had been fully built out and its original residents had been in their houses for more than a decade, something interesting was happening in the development that Levitt had not entirely anticipated. The trees he had planted along the streets, a requirement he had imposed on himself as much as on his residents, had matured. The flat, treeless landscape of the original development, which early photographs show with an almost lunar bareness, had become a canopy of green that changed the visual character of the streets entirely. The houses that had once sat exposed on their lots, like models on a display table, now sat in something more like the established neighbourhood they had been designed to resemble. Nature, moving at its own pace through the planned community, had filled in the gap between what Levitt built and what he had promised. The residents had also filled in their own gaps. Additions had been built, garages had been converted, attics had been finished, fences had gone up, some of them conforming to the community standards and some of them pushing at the edges of what the homeowners association would permit. Gardens had grown elaborate, trees had been removed and replanted, driveways had been widened and decorated. The uniform houses of the original development had been individuated by the work of living in them, each one accumulating the specific marks of a specific family's specific years. The evidence of children grown and rooms repurposed, and taste expressed in the small increments available to a community that still maintained standards about coherence. This is what Levitt had both intended and failed to fully predict. He had intended community. He had built the physical infrastructure for community. What he had not fully predicted was the energy with which that infrastructure would be occupied, the ways in which the identical houses would become differentiated through time and use, the ways in which the restrictions he had placed on modification would create pressure, and that pressure would find release in the details he had not thought to regulate. The suburb that looked uniform from the air in 1948 looked considerably less uniform from the street in 1962, and considerably more interesting, and the people who had made it that way had done so not in defiance of Levitt's vision, but in fulfillment of it, which was, perhaps, his largest success. The second Levittown in Pennsylvania tells a slightly different version of the same story. Built beginning in 1951 on land that had been industrial, a former US steel plant site, the Pennsylvania Levittown was in some ways a more mature product than the Long Island original. Levitt had refined his construction methods. The houses were slightly larger, the design variations were slightly more numerous, the street layouts incorporated lessons from Long Island, and the community infrastructure, the pools and playgrounds and shopping centres, was planned from the beginning rather than built in response to demand. But it was in Levittown, Pennsylvania, that the racial contradiction at the heart of Levitt's project came most publicly to its crisis. The Myers family's attempt to move into their house in August of 1957 was met with a violence that exposed in real time and with the particular clarity that crisis brings to things, usually kept obscured, exactly what the unwritten social rules of the Levittown community were protecting. The crowds outside the Myers house were not a spontaneous eruption. They were the organised expression of a community definition, a statement about who the community considered itself to be and who it was willing to include. The lawn mowing rules and the fence regulations and the casserole standards were all in service of this same community definition. The Myers incident simply made the definition visible in a form that could not be managed by the usual mechanisms of pleasant remarks and significant glances. What happened after the Myers incident was, in its own way, as revealing as the incident itself. William Levitt issued a statement expressing his personal opposition to what had occurred. This statement was noted and appreciated by some observers and dismissed as insufficient by others. Neither response was wrong. Levitt was genuinely troubled by the violence. He was not genuinely troubled by the exclusionary system that had made the violence comprehensible within the community's own logic. His opposition was to the most visible expression of something he'd helped create, the physical confrontation and the burning crosses and the broken windows. His relationship to the structural exclusion that preceded and produced that confrontation was considerably more complicated. William Levitt's financial decline in the 1970s and 80s is often told as a cautionary tale about the dangers of selling your company and then trying to buy it back, which is, at the level of business narrative, accurate. He sold Levitt & Sons to ITT in 1968 for approximately $92 million in ITT stock, which was at the time a significant fortune, but which declined substantially in value over the following years as ITT's stock performance disappointed expectations. He spent much of the 1970s in litigation over the terms of the sale and in failed attempts to re-establish himself in the development business, most notably in a project in Iran that was overtaken by the revolution of 1979 and in other international ventures that consumed the resources he had accumulated. By the time of his death in 1994, Levitt was significantly less wealthy than he had been at his peak, though he remained comfortable by ordinary standards. The Levitt name, however, had outlasted his fortune, embedded in the landscape of 3 communities that bear it, and in the broader cultural shorthand for a particular kind of post-war American suburb, organised, identical, aspiring, exclusionary, deeply human. The name means more things than it meant when he invented it. That is the nature of legacy. It grows beyond the intentions of the person who generated it and takes on the meanings that history assigns to it. What Levitt built endures. Not just the houses which are still standing on Long Island and in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, still occupied, still being modified and individuated by the families inside them. What endures is the template, the way of organising suburban space that Levitt deployed so successfully and so visibly that it became, for a generation of developers who followed him, the model against which all other models were measured. The curving streets and the community amenity and the careful management of coherence and variety are present in every suburb built in the decades after Levittown. Levitt did not invent all of these elements, but he organised them into a legible package and proved at scale and with the evidence of sold-out developments and appreciating property values that the package worked. It is worth asking what working meant in this context. It meant that people bought the houses and lived in them and raised children in them and built wealth in them, on average and in aggregate, though not uniformly and not without conditions. It meant that the schools were good and the streets were safe and the community institutions functioned and the neighbours knew each other's names. These are real goods. They are not nothing. They are, in fact, the things that most people mean when they say they want a good place to live. Levitt delivered them for the people he was willing to deliver them to, with a consistency and at a price that had not been achieved before and has rarely been achieved since. That is the complexity. That is the whole of the accounting. You wake up early on a morning in October of 1956, and the first thing you do before coffee, before the bathroom, before any of the ordinary rituals of the morning is check the list on the nightstand. 2 new families this week, the Hargroves on Sycamore who moved in on Saturday from somewhere in Ohio, and the Mulligans on Birchwood who have been in their house since Wednesday but whom you have not yet visited because Wednesday you had the church rummage sale, and Thursday you had Ruth's baby shower and Friday was not a good day, which is a thing you allow yourself. A not good day once in a while, as long as you make up for it. Today is making up for it. You are the welcome wagon lady for a section of suburban New Jersey that covers approximately 400 homes across 6 streets, which is a territory you have worked for 3 years, since Helen Brewster moved away to Connecticut, and the district coordinator asked if you would consider taking on the responsibility, and you said yes, partly because Helen was the kind of person who did everything perfectly, and you thought you might enjoy being better than Helen at something, which is an uncharitable thought that you have had and have made your peace with. The welcome wagon is not what most people imagine when they hear the name. The name suggests something rustic, something pioneer, a wagon full of baked goods and good intentions. The reality is a structured franchise organisation, a company out of Memphis, Tennessee, that has been operating since 1928, and that by the middle of the 1950s has hostesses in communities across the country, each of them working a defined territory, each of them maintaining relationships with local merchants who contribute coupons and gifts and advertisements to the welcome wagon basket in exchange for the introduction to new families who are, by definition, new customers with unestablished loyalties and fresh needs. You understand this. You've been in the organisation long enough to understand all of its layers. The social layer, which is genuine, the real desire to make new families feel welcomed and oriented, to give them the name of a good dentist and tell them which dry cleaner is reliable and which is not. The commercial layer, which is also genuine, the basket you bring is full of value for the merchants who contributed to it, and for the family that receives it. And the intelligence layer, which is the one that people do not often discuss directly, the fact that a welcome wagon visit is also an assessment, a careful gathering of information about who these new people are and how they are likely to fit into the fabric of the community. That last part is not in any official welcome wagon literature. It is not mentioned in the training sessions or the monthly hostess meetings. It is simply understood by every woman who does this work that part of what you are doing when you knock on a new family's door with your basket is gathering the information that the neighbourhood needs to situate itself around these strangers. You are the first contact. You will be asked by other women on those streets what they are like, and your answer will shape the reception the family receives for months, possibly years. This is not gossip. Or rather, it is gossip in the technical sense, the passing of social information through informal channels, but gossip in its benign form, the kind that serves a social function rather than a destructive one. A neighbourhood needs to know its new members. The welcome wagon visit is the mechanism by which that knowing begins. You eat breakfast quickly and check your basket, which you assembled last night after dinner, a process that takes about 45 minutes and which you have refined over 3 years into a reliable system. The basket is lined with a red and white gingham cloth, which is your personal touch, not standard, because you decided early on that a lined basket said something different than an unlined one, said that care had been taken, that this visit was not perfunctory. Inside the basket, organised by category, are the merchant contributions, a coupon for a free pound of coffee at Henderson's Market, a small sample of hand cream from the pharmacy, a certificate for 10% off a first dry cleaning order, a card from the hardware store with a list of their services, a calendar from the bank. These are the commercial items, and they will be useful, some of them, and they communicate that local businesses know and welcome the new family. But there are also your own contributions, a small card with your name and telephone number, a list you have typed out on your Royal Portable of what you consider essential local information, the best route to the elementary school, the name of the paediatrician most of the neighbourhood uses, the day the library is closed, the address of the nearest Catholic church and the nearest Protestant one, and the temple, because you have learned not to assume. And there is a jar of your strawberry preserves, because the preserves are your signature, the thing that makes your visits memorable, and being memorable is part of the work. The Hargroves first. Sycamore is a 10-minute walk from your house, and you walk it because you do not like to drive short distances, a preference that several of your neighbours find eccentric, and that you defend on the grounds that you need the movement. The morning is cool and bright, one of those October mornings that is almost too beautiful to be real. The maple on the corner of Oak and Sycamore fully red, the light coming through it at an angle that makes the whole street look like a painting. You carry your basket in 2 hands and you walk at a pace that is brisk but not rushed, because arriving flustered is not the impression you want to make. The Hargrove house is the 4th one on the left, and you can tell immediately from the street several things about the family inside it. The moving boxes are still visible through the front window, which tells you they have been too busy to fully unpack, which tells you they have children because children make unpacking take 3 times as long. The front walk has been swept but not edged, which tells you that the husband has made a preliminary effort but has not yet committed to the level of lawn care the street tends to operate at. And there is a casserole dish on the front step, which tells you that someone from the street has already been by, which tells you that the informal network has been faster than you this week. You note all of this without judgment, or rather, with the particular kind of judgment that is not condemnation but classification, the slow taxonomy of a neighbourhood assembling its understanding of new members. You knock. The woman who opens the door is younger than you expected, perhaps 28, with a baby on one hip and hair that has been hastily pinned rather than set, and she looks at you with the expression that new arrivals always have when the welcome wagon arrives, which is a mixture of genuine pleasure at being welcomed and a faint anxiety about whether they are being evaluated, which they are, though you would not say so. You introduce yourself. You say your name and the words "welcome wagon," and she smiles and says, "Oh, she has heard of the welcome wagon. Her mother had mentioned it. Her mother is in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio," and you file this information, Ohio, mother nearby in spirit if not in distance, because this tells you something about what kind of support system she has and what kinds of connections she will be looking to build here. She invites you in, and you step into the front hallway, which is in the controlled chaos of recent moving, boxes labelled in a man's handwriting, a stroller folded against the wall, shoes in a pile near the door that tells you they have at least 3 children, because no household with fewer than 3 children generates that particular density of small footwear. The living room is partially arranged, a sofa positioned but not yet centred, a lamp on the floor rather than on a table. She apologises for the disorder, and you say with complete honesty that you are not looking at the disorder, you are looking at the room, which is a true thing to say and also a kind one. You sit down. She puts the baby in a bouncy chair and goes to make coffee, and while she's in the kitchen you look at the room more carefully, because the room is the first draft of a household's self-presentation, the collection of objects a family brings from their previous life and begins arranging into a new one. There is a bookcase on the wall beside the window, not yet filled, but the books that are there are in neat stacks on the floor in front of it, and there are a lot of them, which tells you this is a family that reads. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive, which in this neighbourhood is not universal, and which you note because it will be relevant when you are deciding which neighbours to introduce her to first. She comes back with 2 cups of coffee and sits down across from you, and you begin the part of the visit that is the actual work, not the basket. The basket is an opening, but the conversation, the 30 or 40 minutes in which you ask about the family, the children, where they have come from and what they are used to and what they hope to find here, and you listen, and you remember, and you offer the information that is most relevant to what you have heard. Her name is Patricia. Her husband Robert works for a company in the city and commutes by train, which is the standard arrangement in this part of New Jersey, and which means that Patricia will be managing the house and the children and the neighbourhood relationships largely without him during the day, which is the standard arrangement and which she seems, from her manner, to already understand. They have 3 children, as you guessed, a boy of 7, a girl of 5, and the baby, who is 4 months. The boy starts at the elementary school Monday, and she's worried about him because he's shy, and the move has been harder on him than on his sister. You make a note, not literally, not in front of her, you make a mental note, about the shy 7-year-old, because there are 2 other families on this street with boys, of approximately that age, and one of them has a boy who is also shy, and who has been looking, his mother has mentioned several times, for a particular kind of friend, not the loud, organised sports kind, but the kind who wants to spend Saturday morning building things in the backyard. You will mention this, not today. Today you are gathering. You tell her about the paediatrician. You tell her about the elementary school's reading programme, which is good, better than average, and which will matter to a family with books on the floor. You tell her about the library's story hour on Wednesday mornings, which is good for the 5-year-old. You do not tell her everything you know, because everything at once is overwhelming, and also because it is better to give information in layers, a reason to come back, a reason to be useful over time rather than in a single transaction. You open the basket and present it, and she looks through it with the attention of someone who is genuinely interested in what she has received, not just politely so, and she holds the card from the hardware store and says that Robert will want to know this, and she holds the preserves and asks if you made them, and when you say yes, she looks at them differently, the way people look at things when they understand they are receiving something personal rather than something standard. Before you leave, you do the thing that is hardest to explain to people who are not welcome wagon hostesses, the thing that is not in any of the official materials and that you have never discussed explicitly with the district coordinator, but that you know, from your own experience and from the conversations you have with other hostesses at the monthly meetings, is the most important thing you do. You give her permission. You do not say it that way. You say it by asking, very casually, whether she has met anyone on the street yet. And when she says only briefly, you say that this neighbourhood takes a little time but that it is worth the time, and that the women here are busy and sometimes take a few weeks to come around, but that this does not mean they are unwelcoming. It means they are managing a great deal, and that their attention, when it comes, is genuine. And you say that if she ever has a question about anything at all, she should call you, and you mean it, and she can hear that you mean it. What you're giving her is the information that she is not going to be immediately and effortlessly absorbed into this community, because no one is, and that the weeks of feeling slightly outside the flow of things are normal and not a judgment on her. You are giving her the knowledge that the system has a learning curve, and that this is the system's characteristic and not her failing. This is the piece of information that new arrivals most need and most rarely get, because everyone else is too busy pretending that their own integration was easy. The Mulligans are a different visit. You have been warned by the district coordinator that the Mulligan family is from New York City, which in this suburb carries a specific set of implications, not unfavourable exactly, but suggestive. A family from Ohio is predictable in its needs and its expectations. A family from New York City might have different ideas about what a neighbourhood should look and feel like, might have different habits and schedules and levels of interest in things like the PTA and the church bazaar and the lawn mowing schedule. They might also be Jewish, though you do not know this for certain and would not adjust your behaviour if you did. But you are aware that several families on Birchwood are not entirely neutral on the question of Jewish neighbours, which is something you have no power over but are aware of, because awareness is part of the work. The Mulligans are not Jewish. They are Irish Catholic, which the street will find manageable. The wife, whose name is Anne, is taller than most women you visit, and she opens the door with a directness that is different from Patricia Hargrove's slightly anxious warmth. Anne Mulligan looks at you and at your basket with the expression of someone assessing a situation rather than receiving one, and you adjust your approach almost without thinking, because reading the room is a skill you've developed over 3 years of these visits, and this room requires a different register. You do not lead with the preserves. You lead with the hardware store card because the house, which you can see behind Anne Mulligan, has clearly been recently and vigorously unpacked. Everything in its place already. The boxes gone, the furniture arranged with intention, and this tells you that Anne Mulligan is efficient and practical, and will appreciate the functional items more than the sentimental ones. You tell her about the school. You tell her about the train schedule because her husband commutes, and she'll want to know when to have dinner ready, which is not something you say aloud, but which is communicated by the way you give the train information as the first piece of practical content. Anne asks you directly whether this is a friendly neighbourhood, not the warm friendly of Patricia Hargrove's question about whether people are nice, but a specific, slightly challenging friendly, meaning are there real connections here or just performance? You think about this for a moment genuinely, and then you tell her the truth, which is that this neighbourhood is friendly in the way that most suburbs are friendly, which is that the friendliness is real but takes time, and that the people here are managing demanding lives and are looking, most of them, for real community, but that they are also managing the performance of community, and that these two things sometimes get confused with each other. Anne Mulligan looks at you for a moment and then says that is the most honest thing anyone has said to her since she arrived, and you say that is what the welcome wagon is for, and she laughs, and the visit takes on a different character after that, the character of two women who have decided to be honest with each other, which is the best kind of visit and also the rarest. You walk home by the long way, not because you need more time, you're on schedule, but because the morning is still beautiful and you have 2 baskets worth of information to process before the next month's hostess meeting, where you will give your report on the new families in your territory, a report that will shape how the women of those streets approach these new arrivals, what they expect and what they extend and what kind of community they are willing to build. You think about Patricia Hargrove and the shy 7-year-old and the books on the floor and the way she held the preserves. You think about Anne Mulligan and her direct question and the way she laughed. You think about what each of them needs from this neighbourhood and what this neighbourhood needs from them, and you think, as you often do on the walk home from these visits, that the work of community is the work of translation, the ongoing effort to make different people legible to each other, to find the language in which Ohio and New York City and the long street of suburban New Jersey can speak to each other across their differences and recognise in what they find there something worth the effort. The basket is lighter on the way home. The street looks the same as it did when you left. The maples and the setbacks and the identical rectangles of front lawn, each one mowed and edged and presenting itself to the morning with the composed orderliness that the neighbourhood requires. But you know, walking through it, that the orderliness is surface and that underneath it are all these different lives in various stages of arrangement, all these different people trying to make something coherent out of the materials at hand. That is the work, not the basket, not the coupons or the preserves or the card with your telephone number. The work is the conversation, the 30 minutes in someone's living room, the careful listening and the honest offering, the slow building of the information that makes neighbours out of strangers. It is not glamorous work. It is not paid, except in the sense that the Welcome Wagon organisation pays you a small commission on the merchant redemptions, which amounts to not very much. It is not recognised in any formal way. Nobody gives you a plaque or a dinner or a certificate. But next spring, at the first neighbourhood block party of the season, you will see Patricia Hargrove standing in a circle with 2 other women from Sycamore, laughing at something, and you will know that you helped that happen. And Anne Mulligan will catch your eye across the yard and nod, and you will nod back, and that will be enough. That will be more than enough for the kind of work that has no other accounting. The hostess meeting happens on the 3rd Thursday of every month at the district coordinator's house on Maple Avenue, and it is one of the more revealing institutions in the Welcome Wagon organisation structure, because it is where the official and the unofficial business of the organisation coexist in the same afternoon with the polite fiction that they are the same thing. The official agenda is always the same: new hostess territories assigned or adjusted, merchant updates, which merchants have joined the basket programme, which have left, any changes to coupon values or gift offerings, organisational announcements from the national office in Memphis, which arrive in a monthly newsletter that the district coordinator reads selectively, presenting the parts that are relevant to this particular group of women, and setting aside the parts that are not, which is itself a form of editorial discretion that the national office probably approves of without acknowledging. And then there is the informal business, which is what everyone came for: the sharing of information about the new families in each hostess's territory, the accumulated intelligence of a month's worth of first visits and follow-up observations, organised and presented in the particular register of women who are performing social nicety, while also conducting genuine assessment. You bring your notes, not written notes. There is a social understanding that written notes are too official for this kind of exchange, but the mental notes that you have been taking since your last visit to each family's house, organised by street and by household, and by the specific question of how each family is integrating into their neighbourhood. Ruth Garrison, who covers the streets west of the highway, reports on a family from Indiana who are settling in well, and whose only notable characteristic is a large and unusually vocal dog, which is already a subject of comment on their street. Helen Park, who covers the older section of the development near the elementary school, reports on a retired couple from upstate New York who seem lovely, but who have not yet connected with any of their neighbours in the way Helen would like to see, and Helen asks whether anyone has suggestions for how to facilitate this, and there is a productive conversation about which neighbourhood families have similarly aged adults and similar retirement patterns. You report on Patricia Hargrove and Anne Mulligan with the care and the particular shape of language that the meeting requires, which is the language of hospitality and welcome, observations about how the family is finding the neighbourhood, what they seem to need, how they might best be supported in their integration. You do not use language that would be called gossipy, which is the word that no one in the group would ever apply to what they are doing here, but which hovers at the edge of the conversation. A word that distinguishes what these women believe themselves to be doing from what they would disapprove of if they saw it elsewhere. The distinction they draw is real, and it is worth taking seriously. What makes their information exchange different from gossip in its destructive form is the quality of the intent, which is genuinely oriented toward welcome rather than exclusion, and the discipline of the framing, which stays focused on how to help rather than how to judge. But the difference is not absolute. The information that gets shared in these meetings shapes the reception that new families receive on their streets, and the reception that new families receive determines, to a significant degree, how they are perceived and how they are included. The power of this information is real, and the women who hold it know it, even if they frame it always in the language of service. After the formal meeting, there is coffee and a cake that one of the hostesses has brought, and the conversation becomes looser and more personal, and this is where you learn the things that did not make it into the official portion of the afternoon. Ruth's frustration with a family on her street who have not responded to her third welcome visit, and who she suspects are going to be difficult in the ways that certain families are difficult, which is the way of not cooperating with the social system that the neighbourhood runs on, not because they are hostile, but because they are private, which in this context amounts to the same thing. Helen's satisfaction with the way a family from 2 months ago has integrated, the wife has joined the church circle, and the husband has been helping with the neighbourhood improvement project, and both of them have been at every block gathering since they arrived. You contribute your own portion of the informal exchange, a little about Patricia Hargrove's shyness, which is the shyness of someone who wants connection but does not know how to initiate it, and a little about Anne Mulligan's directness, which you frame as refreshing rather than alarming, because it is, and because the way you frame it here will influence how the other women in the network approach Anne when they encounter her, you are conscious of doing this framing. You choose your words with awareness of their downstream effects. This is the best version of what the Welcome Wagon hostess does, the mindful management of information in the service of genuine welcome. You drive home in the late afternoon, the light going golden over the suburban landscape, and you think about the morning's work. 2 visits, 45 minutes each, 2 baskets worth of food and coupons and local knowledge, 2 families slightly less lost in their new environment than they were when you knocked. This is the accounting. The Welcome Wagon organisation, when you joined it, presented itself in terms that were cheerful and civic-minded, and unambiguous in their orientation toward welcome, a word the organisation used the way some organisations use the word excellence, as the aspirational standard against which everything else was measured. The training you received when you joined covered the basket preparation and the merchant relationships, and the follow-up visit schedule and the monthly meeting structure. It did not cover what to do when a family did not want to be welcomed, or when the neighbourhood they were moving into had views about them that welcome could not fully address. You encountered this problem twice in your 3 years in the organisation. Once when a family from Puerto Rico moved onto a street in your territory, and the reception from some of their neighbours was significantly less welcoming than you could address with a basket of coupons and a jar of preserves. Once when a family's arrival coincided with a rumour about the husband's employment, a rumour you did not know the source of and could not verify, that was already circulating on the street before you arrived with your basket, and that made your welcome visit feel inadequate in a way you still think about. Neither situation was in your training materials. Both situations required you to do something the Welcome Wagon did not officially ask of you, which was to be honest with someone about what they were walking into, in terms that were specific enough to be useful, but that did not compromise anyone whose information you held in confidence. It required you to operate in the space between your official role, which was to welcome, and your actual knowledge, which was more complicated than welcome could fully address. In the first case, you went back to the Puerto Rican family's house a second time, and then a third, and you introduced the wife to 2 other women in the neighbourhood, who you had reason to think would be good neighbours to her. Women who were, for different reasons, a little outside the main social current of the street and who were therefore more open to new connections. You did not fix the problem. You built a small structure of human connection around the family that made their daily life more manageable, which is the most the Welcome Wagon could offer, and also, in some situations, more than it usually managed to provide. In the second case, you told the family the truth, which was that there was a rumour on the street and that you did not know its source or its content in detail, but that they should be aware of it, and that if they had questions or concerns in the following weeks, they should call you. The husband looked at you when you said this with an expression you remember exactly, the expression of a man who has just been told something he needed to know and did not expect to hear from the Welcome Wagon, and he said thank you in a way that contained more than gratitude. This is the work, not the basket and not the preserves and not the training materials from Memphis. The work is the willingness to be present in the actual situation rather than the official one, to use your access, your institutional cover, your established credibility as a neighbour who visits all the new families, to do something genuinely useful in circumstances that the official script does not cover. You do not always manage this. Some visits are exactly what the training materials describe: comfortable exchanges of information in well-appointed living rooms with coffee and goodwill on both sides, and you leave them feeling that the system is working as intended. Some visits reveal something that the system cannot address, and you leave them feeling the gap between what you were sent to do and what the situation required. But you keep going back. You keep making the visit, carrying the basket, offering the preserves, because the alternative, which is not going, which is leaving new families to find their own way into the social fabric of the neighbourhood without any bridge at all, seems worse. Imperfect welcome is better than no welcome. This is the professional faith that keeps the monthly meeting going, and the territory organised, and the hostess out the door at 8 a.m. with a lined basket over her arm. The Welcome Wagon national organisation continued operating into the late 20th century, eventually evolving away from the basket model toward a digital presence and a series of partnerships with real estate companies and moving services. The basket itself became something of a nostalgic artifact, the image of it summoning a particular moment in American community life that felt, even as it was happening, like something that would eventually be remembered rather than lived. But in the years when it was being lived, when the women with their baskets were walking through the post-war suburbs on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday mornings, the institution they represented was doing something real, however imperfectly, however limited by the social conditions of its moment. It was making the attempt to translate strangers into neighbours, which is the oldest and most necessary social technology any community has ever developed, and which requires, in every generation, someone willing to carry the basket to the door and knock. There is one more dimension of the welcome wagon work that deserves its own accounting, which is the work of receiving the information that new families give you and managing what you do with it. You are told things in those kitchen table conversations that you were not asked about and did not expect. A wife mentions that the move has been difficult because of a situation in the previous city that she does not specify. A husband's job situation is described in terms that suggest more uncertainty than a new arrival in a new house can easily absorb. A child's recent behaviour is mentioned with a kind of oblique worry that tells you the family is managing something they are not yet ready to name. These are the things that come out in the specific conversational space that a welcome wagon visit creates, which is neither a social call, with its careful maintenance of surfaces, nor an official intake, with its formal structure and its implications of institutional judgment. It is something in between, a space in which people feel, without quite meaning to, that they can say a little more than they usually would. What you do with what you are told in that space is a question that the welcome wagon training does not answer, and that you have had to work out for yourself over 3 years of visits. The default is discretion, which is close to silence, the understanding that what is shared in someone's kitchen on a Tuesday morning is not for redistribution at the monthly meeting, or the church circle, or the backyard conversation over the fence. People tell you things in confidence, not formal confidence. No one says, please keep this private, but in the implicit confidence of a private space and a one-on-one conversation, and that confidence deserves to be honoured. But discretion is not always the same as silence, and silence is not always the right answer. When a family tells you something that suggests they are in genuine difficulty, difficulty of the kind that a community can help address if it knows about it, the question of whether to say something carefully to the right person in the right register is not a simple one. You're a welcome wagon hostess, not a case manager. You're not equipped to assess need or coordinate resources in any official way. But you are a neighbour, and a neighbour who knows that another neighbour is struggling has some responsibility to the knowledge. You have navigated this twice in 3 years. Both times you said something carefully to one person each time, a woman you trusted to receive the information with the same discretion you had applied in gathering it. Both times something useful happened as a result. You do not know if you were right to do what you did. You think you were. You think the alternative, which was silence, would have been less right. But you also know that this kind of judgment is never clean, and that the unwritten rules about information and discretion and the appropriate boundaries of neighbourly concern are as complex in their way as the unwritten rules about lawn height and holiday decoration. The welcome wagon basket sits in the hallway now, empty and waiting for next week's assembly. The red gingham lining has been washed and pressed and folded back into the basket. The notebook is on the desk with its green cover and its careful notes. The telephone list of new families in the territory is updated and clipped to the front page. Everything is in order, everything is ready. Outside the window, the afternoon has settled into the specific quality of a midweek October afternoon in suburban New Jersey. The light going amber over the lawns, the leaves beginning to turn on the trees that Levitt's planners specified for this street, and the trees that the families themselves have planted in the years since. The aggregate of all those individual decisions accumulating into something that looks, from a certain angle, like permanence, like a neighbourhood that has always been here, like a place that knows itself. You watch the street for a moment before turning back to whatever the afternoon requires next. You think about Patricia Hargrove, who is probably putting her daughter down for a nap right now, in a house that is slightly less disordered than when you saw it this morning. You think about Anne Mulligan, who's probably doing something efficient with the afternoon, because Anne Mulligan is the kind of woman who uses time efficiently. You think about the shy 7-year-old who will need a friend, and about the boy 2 streets over who might be that friend, and about the small specific thing you can do to make that connection possible. This is the work. This is all of it. Small and unrecorded and perfectly ordinary and in its quiet way, the thing that holds the whole system together. The photographs from the 1950s American suburb have a particular quality of light. It is the light of a studio, controlled and flattering, applied to the domestic world with the same professional intention that studios applied it to film stars. The kitchen gleams, the lawn is perfect. The woman standing at the counter or in the garden or serving a meal to an assembled family is composed, rested and smiling with the specific ease of someone who has nothing difficult to manage. She is wearing a dress and her hair is set, and the dress and the hair are part of the message, the visual statement that this household is in order, that its manager is in control, and that the post-war American dream is proceeding exactly as advertised. What the photographs did not show, what they were professionally designed not to show, was the afternoon of the same woman, 2 hours after the picture was taken, sitting at her kitchen table with a headache she's been ignoring since breakfast, and a list of obligations she cannot complete in the available hours. They did not show the specific anxiety that attended every social interaction on the street. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The constant monitoring and assessment that passed as neighbourliness, the way every lawn and every curtain and every casserole brought to a sick neighbour communicated standing, the way standing could be lost with a speed that bore no proportion to the offence. The unwritten social rules of the post-war suburb were not in the main written anywhere. That was their power. A written rule can be challenged, argued with, taken to a meeting and debated. An unwritten rule is everywhere and nowhere. It exists in the pleasant remark and the significant glance and the conversation that stops when you approach. It exists in the social weather of the street, in the warmth or coolness of the reception you receive at the neighbourhood gathering, in whether your children are included in the informal arrangements that structure a suburban child's social life. The rules were enforced not by authority, but by the collective management of belonging, the constant implicit negotiation over who was fully inside the community and who was operating at a slight deficit. The lawn was the primary public text of a 1950s suburban household, and it was read with the attention and the interpretive sophistication that Victorian England brought to calling cards. Too long was the obvious violation, the failure of maintenance that suggested neglect or indifference, or the specific domestic collapse that the neighbourhood understood as a family in trouble. But there were subtler readings available to practised eyes. Edges that were not quite straight spoke of haste, of a man who mowed but did not finish the job, which raised questions about his approach to other obligations. A lawn that was mowed too short, scalped down to a pale and patchy surface, spoke of overcompensation, of effort that had exceeded its own purpose, which was almost as worrying as insufficient effort. The ideal lawn was not a lawn that announced itself. It was a lawn that was simply, quietly, evidently correct, the visual equivalent of a well-maintained posture. The holiday decoration calendar was another system, and it was stricter than most newcomers expected. Decorations appeared at the right time and were taken down by the right time, and the right time was a community standard maintained through observation and social pressure rather than any official schedule. Christmas decorations that were still up after the 6th of January were a subject of conversation. Not hostile conversation, that would have been direct, and directness on the subject of holiday decoration was not available. But conversation that was somehow more memorable for its pleasantness, a remark delivered with such warmth that you could not object to it without seeming unreasonable, that nonetheless conveyed clearly that you had been noticed, and that what had been noticed was not entirely in your favour. The timing and content of casseroles was a subject of genuine social complexity. The practice of bringing food to a neighbour in difficulty, illness, a new baby, a death in the family was universal and sincere. But what you brought communicated your assessment of the situation and your relationship to the recipient, and getting either wrong created complications. A casserole that was too elaborate suggested that you were using someone's misfortune as an occasion to display your cooking, which was considered a misallocation of the gesture. A casserole that was too plain suggested insufficient care. A casserole made with unfamiliar ingredients was ambitious in a way that could read as presumptuous. Not everyone wanted to receive something they did not recognise when they were managing a difficult time. The ideal casserole was recognisable, competent and appropriately sized for the household, which meant you needed to know the household, and knowing the household was itself a form of social capital that the casserole both expressed and reinforced. The management of children was one of the most closely monitored dimensions of suburban social life, and one of the least openly discussed. Everyone understood that how children behaved in public reflected on their parents, particularly their mothers, who were at home and theoretically in constant supervision of the children's formation. A child who was polite, who addressed adults correctly, who did not run through other people's gardens or leave a bicycle in the driveway where a car could hit it, was evidence of a mother who was doing her job. A child who did any of these things was also evidence of a different kind, and the evidence was not forgotten. The social obligation to appear competent and untroubled was so pervasive and so well maintained that many women of this era report, in their memoirs and in the interviews that historians later conducted with them, that they had no idea for years that their neighbours were experiencing the same pressures they were, because everyone was managing the presentation so carefully that the management itself was invisible. You thought you were the only one who found it hard. You thought the ease on everyone else's face was real ease, and the difficulty on yours was a failure of character or constitution or the right attitude. The discovery, when it came, that the ease was largely performed, that nearly everyone on the street was managing a version of the same presentation while privately experiencing a version of the same difficulty, was, for many women, one of the more disorienting revelations of their middle age. The doctor's office was where some of this pressure finally found a vocabulary. The era's physicians, most of them men, encountered a patient population of suburban housewives who were experiencing what they described as nerves or exhaustion, or a persistent low-grade unhappiness that had no single identifiable cause. The prescribing response to these presentations became one of the quiet institutional facts of the era. Milltown, the brand name for meprobamate, was introduced in 1955 and became, within a year, the best-selling pharmaceutical in the country, the first prescription drug in American history to sell more than 1 billion tablets in a single year. It was prescribed overwhelmingly to women. Advertisements for it in medical journals showed a woman, housewife or professional, in a state of visible distress, and then, after treatment, composed and functioning. The function was the goal. The question of why distress was so prevalent in a population theoretically living the ideal life was not the primary focus of the advertisement. The specific pressure on the suburban housewife was compounded by the acceleration of consumer culture in the post-war years. The same decade that produced the lawn mowing rule and the casserole ethics and the holiday decoration calendar also produced an unprecedented expansion of the domestic product market, each year bringing new appliances, new convenience foods, new cleaning products, new standards of domestic hygiene and presentation that represented themselves as labour-saving, but which, in practice, raised the standard to which the labour was held. The automatic washer did not reduce the time spent on laundry. It made laundry more frequent, because cleanliness standards rose in proportion to the ease with which they could be met. The vacuum cleaner did not reduce the time spent cleaning. It raised the expected frequency of cleaning. The kitchen, as the advertisers designed it, required more and more consistent maintenance to be considered properly maintained, and the woman inside it was evaluated not against the kitchen's inherent demands, but against the image in the advertisement, which showed a kitchen that appeared to maintain itself effortlessly. The social rules about what you could and could not discuss in public compounded all of this. The conversational culture of the post-war suburb operated on the principle that difficulty was private, and that its privateness was a virtue. A woman who complained about the burdens of domestic life was a woman who did not appreciate what she had, and not appreciating what you had was both a moral failing and a social one. It made other people uncomfortable. It suggested that the shared project of maintaining the image of the good life was less important to you than it should be. The correct response to difficulty was to manage it quietly and present the composed surface that the community expected. Women who broke this rule, who expressed unhappiness or exhaustion, or the specific claustrophobia of a life conducted entirely within the radius of a half-mile of one's own kitchen, were regarded with a combination of sympathy and alarm, the alarm being the larger part because unhappiness was contagious in the way that honesty is always contagious in a community built partly on pretense. This is not the whole story of the 1950s suburb, and it would be wrong to present it as such. The communities were also real. The friendships were real. The genuine warmth of a neighbourhood where your children could play outside unsupervised, and where your neighbours would notice if your lights were not on by evening, and where the block party in August was an event that people actually looked forward to. That was real too. The question is not whether the post-war suburb was good or bad. That is not a question that a piece of geography can answer. The question is what it cost to maintain it, and the cost was borne almost entirely by the women inside it, the women who managed the performance of the unwritten rules while also managing the reality underneath the performance, who held the tension between the image and the life with a competence that was rarely acknowledged and never fully paid. Betty Friedan published her book in 1963, the one that named what she called the problem that has no name, and the response to it, from suburban women across the country, was not primarily debate or disagreement, it was recognition. Women wrote to her and said yes. Women called the publisher and said someone has finally said the thing. The scale of that recognition told you something about how widely the gap between the official image and the lived reality had been experienced, and how long it had been carried in private, and how much it had cost the people carrying it to do so without complaint, without language, without the simple social permission to say that the gleaming kitchen in the advertisement was not the whole truth about what it felt like to be inside it. The unwritten rules of the neighbourhood did not disappear in 1963. They evolved, adapted, and in many cases simply migrated to new communities and new eras with new surface concerns, but the same underlying machinery, the machinery of belonging and exclusion, the constant social accounting of who was inside and who was out, the performance of normalcy that cost so much more than anyone with the power to change it was willing to acknowledge. The post-war suburb was not a problem with an easy solution. It was an arrangement that served some people very well, that gave them community and safety and the steady appreciation of a piece of American land, and that asked others to carry the full weight of maintaining the conditions under which all of that was possible. That is the gap the photographs did not show, not the messy house, or the uncut lawn, or the still-standing Christmas wreath in mid-January. The gap was inside the composed smile of the woman at the counter, in the specific arithmetic of what it took to produce that composure every single day, and in the long years during which no one who was not already inside the kitchen felt it was their place to ask. The question of what the suburb actually required of the people inside it, and who paid the largest share of that requirement, is one that took decades to be asked clearly in the public culture. When Betty Friedan interviewed suburban housewives in the late 1950s for the book she was writing, she found women who could not find the language for what they were experiencing. They had houses and husbands and children and appliances. They had the material conditions that the culture had told them constituted happiness. What they had in addition to all of this was a persistent sense of something missing, something wrong, something that could not be named, and the inability to name it was part of what made it so difficult to address. You cannot seek help for a problem that has no name. You cannot compare notes with your neighbour about a feeling that does not yet have a word. Friedan gave it a word, or rather a phrase, and the phrase spread with the speed of something that was already understood and simply waiting to be said. The problem that has no name, she wrote, is the problem of suburban housewives who are educated and capable and fully alive in ways that their domestic roles do not engage, and who experience the gap between what they are and what they are allowed to be as a form of slow interior damage that the culture does not acknowledge and the medical system treats with sedatives. The reaction to the book when it appeared in 1963 was divided in ways that tell you a great deal about the social pressures of the moment. Many women felt seen. Many other women, including many suburban housewives, were angry or dismissive or defended the life Friedan was analysing with a conviction that was itself evidence of how much had been invested in it. To say that the suburb was not working was to say that the sacrifice had been wrong, and the sacrifice had been too large and too personal for that accusation to be easily received. What the book could not fully address, and what has taken historians another 50 years to begin to properly document, is the way the social rules of the suburb functioned as an enforcement system for the domestic arrangement Friedan was analysing. The unwritten rules were not neutral. They were not simply the organic expression of community preferences. They were a system for ensuring that women remained in the domestic role, and that deviations from that role were met with a social cost sufficient to discourage them. A woman who worked outside the home in a 1950s suburb was not common. When she existed, her existence was managed through a set of social framings that minimized its implications. She was said to work out of necessity, which transformed her employment from a choice into a circumstance beyond her control, which made it acceptable because it did not challenge the primary assumption that women who had the choice would choose the domestic role. She was said to work in a field that was an extension of domestic nurturing, teaching, nursing, clerical support, which preserved the category boundary between women's work and men's work even when women were present in the workplace, and she was said to manage her domestic responsibilities as though she did not work, keeping the house and providing the meals and maintaining the social relationships at the standard the neighbourhood expected, which meant that her employment added to her obligations rather than redistributing them. The neighbourhood's enforcement of these framings was not overt. It was atmospheric, conducted in the register of pleasant concern and gentle inquiry rather than direct prohibition. "Are you managing all right?" is a question that sounds like neighbourly care. When it is asked regularly, with a particular frequency and emphasis, by women who know that you have taken a part-time position at the bank, it becomes something else, a pressure check, a measurement of whether you are maintaining the appearances that the community requires, despite having added an obligation that the community did not expect of you. The clothing rules were another dimension of the enforcement system that operated below explicit acknowledgement. What a suburban housewife wore during the day was, like the lawn and the casserole and the set of the hair, a form of communication about her relationship to her domestic role. A woman who received the morning visitors in her house dress and her curlers was a woman who was not taking her public presentation seriously, which was understood as evidence of something troubling in her general management of the household. A woman who answered the door in a full house dress, pressed and neat, with her hair done and her lipstick on, was a woman who had organised her morning correctly, who was prepared for the social interactions the day might produce, who was, in the language of the neighbourhood, on top of things. Being on top of things was the standard, and the standard was exhausting, and the exhaustion was not to be mentioned. This is the specific cruelty of a social system that requires the maintenance of an appearance of effortless management. Not only must you manage, you must appear to do so effortlessly, and the appearance of effort undermines the standard. The woman who admits she is tired is the woman who is not managing well enough to hide it, and not managing well enough to hide it is its own form of failure in a community that runs on presentation. The management of the children's social lives was another dimension of the unwritten rules that has been underappreciated in the historical accounts of this era. Children's social relationships were not simply childhood friendships. They were diplomatic relations between families, conducted by proxy through the children, but experienced by the mothers in the full complexity of adult social politics. When your son played with the neighbour's son, the families were in relationship. When that relationship went well, it generated social credit. When it went badly, when the children argued or one of them behaved in a way that reflected poorly on his upbringing, the fallout was managed by the mothers in a register that had nothing to do with children and everything to do with the standing of the households involved. The birthday party was one of the more elaborate social productions of suburban childhood life, and its management was entirely the mother's responsibility. The guest list was a political document. Inviting too few children was exclusive in a way that would be noted. Inviting too many was a logistical and financial commitment that had to be weighed against the social cost of appearing to be operating beyond your means. The food and the games and the decorations communicated the family's taste and organisation and financial situation in ways that were read and remembered. A birthday party that went badly, that had insufficient food or unmanaged children or a cake that did not measure up, was an event that followed a family for a social season. The PTA was the formal institution through which a large proportion of suburban social politics was conducted. It was officially a parent-teacher association, focused on the educational welfare of the neighbourhood's children. In practice, it was a social institution with educational activities attached, a structure within which the social hierarchy of the neighbourhood was organised, maintained and periodically renegotiated. The committees were the unit of social work, and which committee you were on, and what role you played within it, determined your position in the neighbourhood's informal power structure with a precision that no formal institutional chart could have captured. The room mother was the most visible committee role, the woman who organised the classroom parties and coordinated the parental support activities and served as the connection between the teacher and the parent population of a given class. Being room mother was a significant social position, and the selection process for room mother was one of the more naked expressions of social hierarchy that the neighbourhood produced. It was presented as a volunteer matter. In practice, it was a competition that everyone understood and no one discussed directly. Women who wanted to be room mother and did not achieve it often found that their non-selection was followed by a subtle adjustment in their social position. Not a demotion exactly, but a slight recalibration of the attention they received and the invitations they were included in, as if the community's assessment of their standing had been updated by the information that the selection process had provided. Women who were selected found that the role required an investment of time and organisational effort that was more substantial than anyone had suggested in advance, and that the social rewards for performing it well were real, but calibrated to a standard that moved upward in proportion to the quality of the performance. This is the hidden machinery of the post-war suburb that no advertisement showed and no magazine spread captured. The continuous social work of maintaining standing, managing relationships, performing competence, and absorbing the costs of a system that required a great deal of women and offered them in return a community that was sometimes genuine and sometimes a performance of community, and often simultaneously both. The women who lived inside it were not naive. They understood the system. They had usually been raised by women who had operated within similar systems and who had transmitted the operative knowledge of how to navigate it, when to perform, when to resist, when to invest in the community's standards because the community was genuinely worth investing in. They were also not without pleasure in it. This is worth saying clearly, because the history of the post-war suburb has sometimes been written as a history of oppression and nothing else, which is its own distortion. There were genuine friendships built in those identical houses. There was genuine community in the block parties and the PTA committees and the carpooling arrangements and the casseroles brought to sick neighbours. There was genuine pleasure in the well-kept garden and the well-run household and the dinner that came out right and the children who turned out well. These things were real. They were earned. They deserved acknowledgement. What they did not deserve was the requirement that the difficulty that produced them be invisible, that the work be performed without complaint, that the cost be absorbed without accounting. The suburb asked a great deal of the women inside it and returned to them a great deal in community and belonging and the specific material comfort of a new house, in a good neighbourhood, with working appliances and children in good schools. It simply did not ask them what they thought of the exchange, and it did not make the exchange easy to refuse, and it did not acknowledge that the exchange was an exchange at all, which is perhaps the oldest unfairness in any domestic arrangement, and which took generations to name, and which some people are still arguing about today. The children of the post-war suburbs grew up inside the unwritten rules the way fish grow up inside water, unable to fully perceive the medium that shapes them. They learned the rules by absorption, by observation, by the 1,000 small corrections of posture and tone and behaviour that their parents applied daily without necessarily announcing what they were correcting for or why. They learned that the lawn was a form of communication by watching what happened when it was not maintained. They learned that certain curtain arrangements were appropriate and certain others were not, by noticing which houses attracted comment and which were overlooked. They learned that the casserole conveyed relationship standing by receiving casseroles in moments of family difficulty and watching their mothers assess them. What they could not learn, because it was not taught to them, was the history of where the rules came from, the specific post-war moment that produced them, the economic and social and demographic conditions that made the suburb possible and that made its rules feel so necessary and so natural. The rules were presented as simply correct, as the way things were done, as evidence of good character and community membership. That they were contingent, historically produced, and in some cases arbitrary, was not part of the education. This meant that the children who grew up in Levittown and in the thousands of developments that replicated its model carried the rules with them when they left, and that many of them applied those rules in the new context of their adult lives, and that some of those rules held and some of them did not, and that the process of sorting out which occupied a significant portion of the social history of the following decades. The baby boomers who grew up in the post-war suburbs became, in their late adolescence and young adulthood, the primary disruptors of many of the institutions those suburbs had built. The lawn mowing rules and the casserole standards and the PTA hierarchies and the presentation requirements were all subjected to the particular scrutiny of a generation that had been raised inside them and was now old enough to question what they had been raised for. The questioning was not always fair. Some of it projected backward a consciousness that was not available to the people who had made the original arrangements, who had been operating inside the constraints and the possibilities of their specific historical moment. The housewife who wore her house dress and set her hair and brought the right casserole was not a passive victim of a system she could see through and refused to resist. She was a person managing her life with the tools her moment provided, making the best of an arrangement that had genuine goods in it, alongside genuine costs, and the tools of understanding and resistance and alternative that are available now are not available then. But the questioning was also often correct. The suburb did ask too much of women. The rules did enforce a domestic arrangement that limited women's lives in ways they had not fully chosen and could not fully refuse. The cheerful surface did conceal a reality that was considerably more complicated and costly. These things are true, and the generation that named them was doing necessary work, even when it was doing that work with less historical generosity than the people being named might have deserved. The physical suburbs themselves continued after the era of their founding rules. The houses are still there. The curved streets still curve the way Levitt designed them to curve. The setbacks and the lot sizes and the basic grammar of the post-war suburban street are still legible in the landscape of American residential geography. But the social rules that organized life inside them have changed, some replaced by new rules, and some simply dissolved into a more permissive general atmosphere in which the window curtain and the lawn and the casserole still communicate but communicate differently. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive, in a register that is less regulated and less systematically monitored than the one that produced the era's particular social intensity. What has not changed is the fundamental human desire for community that the suburb was designed to serve, the desire for safety and belonging, and the knowledge that your neighbours know your name and will notice if something is wrong. The delivery system has changed. The specific rules have changed. The exclusions, at least some of them, have changed. But the desire underneath them, the wish to live in a place that is coherent and comprehensible, and that contains people who will show up when you need them, that desire is the same. It produced the post-war suburb in the specific form that produced all the lawn mowing rules, and the casserole standards, and the welcome wagon baskets, and the PTA committees. And it is producing in every generation new versions of the same essential project, the attempt to make a community out of proximity, which is always harder than it looks, and always more worth the effort than anyone admits when they are in the middle of it. And that, I think, is where we leave tonight's journey, not with the photograph, with the woman behind the photograph. We spent time tonight in 4 different corners of the same world, the post-war American suburb in the years when it was new and strange and full of its own particular energy and its own particular cost. We watched a woman navigate a Tuesday morning with the careful attention of someone who understands that the ordinary details of domestic life are also a form of communication, a continuous conversation with the neighbourhood about who you are and what you are worth and whether you belong. We followed William Levitt across the potato farms of Long Island and into the extraordinary, deeply flawed project of building a community out of an assembly line, and we sat with the permanent complication of what was built and who was left out of it. We walked a neighbourhood with a woman whose job was to translate new families into the language of their street, to make strangers legible to each other, doing work that was largely invisible and entirely indispensable, and we looked, finally, at what the magazine photographs cropped out, at the specific cost of the performance of normalcy, at the weight that the unwritten rules placed on the women who were primarily responsible for maintaining them. What connects these 4 pieces is not the suburb itself, though the suburb is where they all live. What connects them is the distance between the official image and the human reality, the gap between what post-war American life was supposed to look and feel like and what it actually felt like inside the skin of the people who were living it. That gap was not unique to the 1950s. It is not unique to suburbs. It is one of the permanent conditions of organized human life, the distance between the way a community presents itself and the way it is experienced by the people inside it. But the 1950s suburb had a particular and unusually well-documented version of this gap, because it was an era that invested heavily in its own image, that produced more photographs and advertisements and magazine spreads and television programs, showing the ideal version of itself than perhaps any previous era had, and the contrast between that image and the documented reality of the women who maintained it is therefore unusually legible. The women we have been thinking about tonight were real, or variations of people who were real, living real lives in houses that still exist on streets that still curve the way Levitt designed them to curve. Some of them found genuine community in those houses and on those streets. Some of them were quietly and persistently miserable and found no language for it until a book appeared in 1963 that gave them one. Most of them were somewhere in the middle, as most people in most conditions are, managing the genuine pleasures and the genuine difficulties of a life that was theirs in all its specific, ordinary, demanding, occasionally beautiful particularity. They mowed their lawns and brought their casseroles and walked to the A&P and argued with their children about eggs, and stood in the early morning with their hands around a cold percolator waiting for the coffee smell to tell them the day was beginning. They were in the photographs, composed and smiling, and they were behind the photographs, tired and complicated and doing the work that made the photographs possible. Both things were true, both things are worth holding. There is something I find genuinely moving about ordinary life when I look at it closely enough. Not the nostalgia. I am not interested in the soft focus version of the past that turns difficulty into charm. I am interested in the actual texture of actual days, in what it felt like to stand at a particular counter, in a particular decade with a particular set of obligations and a particular set of small pleasures, and the full weight of a life that was yours to manage. That texture is worth recovering, worth taking seriously, worth spending an evening with. So wherever you are tonight, whatever street you live on, whatever the particular unwritten rules of your own community might be, I hope the evening has been a good one. I hope you have found something in tonight's journey that felt familiar, or surprising, or worth carrying into tomorrow. And I hope that somewhere in the quiet at the end of this, in the warmth of the blanket and the settling of the night, you have a moment to think about all the women who stood at all the kitchen windows in all the suburbs that ever existed, looking out at a morning that was theirs to navigate, and managed it, and did it again the next day and the day after that, with a competence that was never fully counted and a grace that was almost never named. Somewhere, on a street that curves the way Levitt designed it to curve, in a kitchen with formica in a pattern called boomerang, a woman who has been on her feet since before the sun fully committed to rising is sitting down at last. The children are at school. The house is quiet. The coffee is still warm. She has earned this. She knows it. Nobody's going to tell her, but she knows it. Sleep well. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.